Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. And tonight, I'm delighted to be chairing an in-conversation between our Director General, David Frost, and Kathryn Porter, the author of this fantastic new publication released today, Just Stop Oil, ? Which we will be providing some answers to later. So, Kathryn, you are the author of the What Logic blog and have been writing on these issues for, is it 7, 8 years now?
10. Our 10th anniversary is in April.
I mean, for several years, I thought Kathryn was actually a form of ChatGPT, a sort of artificial intelligence that just knew everything there was to know about energy. And anybody who wants to know about this stuff has been using Kathryn's blog to inform them for all of that period. It's absolutely fantastic. So we're very honoured that you've decided to write for us. David has joined the IEA as Director General in the last 6 weeks and has got that slightly scared look in his eyes of somebody who's walked into this august institution and realised that we're all human beings, really. And we are so delighted to have you. I mean, David has experience, as you know, as the Brexit negotiator. And I understand that after that particular position had finished, he was inundated with offers from renewable energy companies who wanted him to negotiate their contracts to difference. But he stayed true to his principles, and he's here with us today. So without further ado, Kathryn, would you like to explain what is in the report?
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. So the question mark here is obviously quite critical. In 120 pages, I basically say no, 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 and so on. And I think really a lot of what's in the report can be summarized by the illustration on page 13, because on page 13, I've just got a graphic which I made, which gives some idea of the uses of oil and gas in everyday life. And I think this is something that's dropped out of the public discourse that really needs to be reinstated, that oil and gas are absolutely fundamental to our modern lives, and that the notion that we should stop either using or producing oil and gas is really born from a position of privilege. And it tends to be spoken by people who've never experienced energy insecurity, who've never known food insecurity, and who've never had a lack of access to modern medicine. If you were to walk into a hospital, aside from the people, it's actually quite difficult to identify anything that's not made out of petrochemicals. And what a lot of people don't understand is almost every drug licensed for use in this country is made out of oil. And the machines that administer them are also made out of oil. And the diagnostic equipment that determines which ones you should use are made out of oil. The bed and the chairs that you sit on, the floors that you walk on, even the walls, it doesn't look like oil, but it's made out of oil. And so if we tried to stop oil, we'd effectively be stopping modern life. Obviously, technology depends on oil and gas. Modern agriculture completely depends on methane. Methane is the core ingredient for fertiliser. A few years ago, Sri Lanka announced a ban on synthetic fertiliser, and this was hailed by environmentalists as being sort of a groundbreaking development that everyone should emulate. And yet, within a few months, they completely destroyed their economy. They required a bailout from the IMF. They had food riots because they could no longer feed their own people. And very quietly, a few months later, this ban was reversed. But it did an enormous amount of damage. And it really indicates the naivety of this idea that we can just stop oil. We cannot just stop oil. It sounds like a very sort of nice glib slogan, but actually, if we were to try and do it, we would cause an enormous amount of harm. And so what this report really does is set that context. It says we can't just stop oil. We're going to rely on oil and gas for decades to come, not just in energy, but across our economies. And so the real question isn't stop oil or not stop oil. It's how do we live with the reality of that? And right now, we're not doing that in a coherent way. We have a resource under the North Sea that we are deliberately sabotaging. There is plenty more oil and gas to be extracted from the North Sea. This is not a challenge of geology, it's a challenge of ideology. And in the last year, we've seen Norway make significant discoveries adjacent to the UK continental shelf. In fact, some of those discoveries, almost certainly those reservoirs extend underneath our territory. So if we don't extract that oil and gas ourselves, we are going to pay Norway to sell our own oil and gas back to us. And we're increasing our imports from elsewhere. And we know that the environmental footprint of imported hydrocarbons is much higher than the environmental footprint of hydrocarbons we produce ourselves. And we don't get any of the fiscal benefit from that production if we're importing it. So it's completely idiotic to say we're going to stop oil and gas, we're going to have bans on drilling, we're going to impose an extremely harmful fiscal regime, which will put us into decommissioning years earlier than we expected, and that will result in net cash outflows from the Treasury. So we won't be receiving receipts, we will be paying under the decommissioning regime, and all of that is just harmful to the UK economic interests. And so really my report is we have to stop the just stop oil, and we have to come back to some sort of coherence when it comes to our policy around energy.
Thank you, Kathryn. David?
Gosh, well, one of the things that I find fascinating at the moment is why this kind of collective madness seems to have seized so many Western economies at the same time. Why are we not thinking hard about these questions? Why have we just allowed ourselves to be taken over by this ideology? And now, why is it changing? When I first left government, I became a trustee for Global Warming Policy Foundation for a bit, and they asked me to give a speech to them as I joined, and I said, we've all been working for 20 years, you in particular, to change this debate, and you've achieved almost nothing. And then with my feigned predictive powers, shortly after I'd given that, actually the debate did begin to change. And all of a sudden, the ideas that are in your pamphlets are not quite conventional wisdom yet, but there's certainly things you can now say that you couldn't have easily said a couple of years ago, unless you were very confident of your own income and your own ability to go run your own life. And why I found the juxtaposition of these two things quite interesting, that the madness is still there, yet the pushback is beginning, and yet there's no evidence, at least in Britain, that any change is happening. And I wonder whether you have a sort of explanation for why it's like this.
I think here we now move quite firmly away from the territory of energy into more sort of the political economic sphere. And I've been doing a fair amount of thinking about this in the last year around why we're seeing change in a variety of different ways. And I think if we link all of these things together, what we're seeing is we're coming to the end of an era and we're about to start a new era. And the era that's ending is really the one that began at the end of the Cold War, where effectively governments in the West understood that with the end of the Cold War, the existential threats that came with the Cold War effectively had dissipated. And so now we were entering a period of unusually benign geopolitical context. We had a very benign fiscal environment. Interest rates were trending downwards. The fact that we weren't really seeing productivity growth, or that productivity wasn't so much declining, but growth wasn't growing. Productivity wasn't particularly growing. And this really didn't matter because demographics were still also reasonably benign. They were starting to turn the corner, but it was a very slow process. And so there was a huge capacity for governments to borrow, and there was a huge capacity for governments to regulate. And so effectively in the years that followed, we saw massive expansions of the state funded by debt and huge expansion of regulation. And environmental regulation is just part of that. But we've seen an enormous growth of regulation that now effectively strangles our ability to grow. Even the current government recognises this. In their more honest moments, they will recognise that the government doesn't even run the country. So much power has been devolved to technocratic, unaccountable bodies that it's almost impossible to get anything done. You can't build anything, you can't grow anything. And we're now seeing this coming through in economic performance because demographics are very much moving against us. And we're exiting that period of the sort of benign fiscal environment that we saw. Interest rates are not going to be on that downward trend anymore, and the decline in productivity is really going to matter. So effectively, the ability to keep borrowing our way out of trouble is coming to an end. And with the public has been experiencing in the last few years a real sustained reduction in living standards. And that is causing them to start questioning. And we see different trigger points in different countries. So immigration is clearly something that people have latched onto as an area of concern, but it's not the only one. I think people are starting to understand that energy is expensive and that at least in part that's a choice. And so we're getting dissatisfaction starting to manifest in different ways. We're seeing this politically. We saw the performance of AfD in the German elections. We obviously see the success of MAGA in the US. We see the growth or the move away from the political centre in a lot of different places. And so without wanting to make comments about the rights and wrongs of different political positions, this is effectively, I think, a reflection of the status quo no longer working and no longer satisfying the needs of people. And I think the reaction now towards energy policy is just part of that wider picture.
So just Ed Miliband sadly can't be here tonight. And I am a very inadequate substitute. But if he were, what he would say at this point is that this is all completely wrong. And he is on a mission to reduce energy bills by adopting the cheapest form of energy possible, which all of his very clever advisors tell him is renewables. And no amount of evidence to the contrary is going to convince him otherwise. So what is the response to that?
Well, if no amount of evidence can convince him to the contrary, then he is taking an ideological position or a rational position, and that doesn't have a place in public policy. So if he's not willing to look at evidence and be willing to have his opinion changed by evidence, then he shouldn't be in the job that he's doing. He should go and join the church or found his own church. He shouldn't be the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero.
I mean, the interesting question, I guess, is, why is so much contrary evidence simply discounted by the people who are in charge? And this isn't just Ed Miliband, of course. The previous government was nearly as bad on most of this. Yet the evidence that renewables push up prices was pretty strong then and is even stronger now. And yet you have this whole bureaucracy who, is not really interested in looking at contrary evidence. I don't know what it would take in economic evidential numbers terms to change their minds. They're just locked in politically, and that's the problem, isn't it?
Well, I think part of the issue is, and this comes back to the governance question, is the politicisation of the civil service. And I think what the Conservatives observed when they left office was that the information quality and the integrity of the information that they received from their officials didn't line up particularly well with information that they then found when they left office and didn't have officials to support them anymore. Now, it's one thing to have experienced that change through 14 years, because what triggered that effectively was the Constitutional Governance and Reform Act that was passed in 2010, so just before the Conservatives came into government. And that removed the ability of ministers to hire and fire civil servants. And effectively, it allowed the civil service to develop or further develop its own political identity. And I think that is something that you don't see when you're inside it, but it became pretty clear when they left. So I have some sympathy actually for the Conservatives making bad decisions based on bad information because they didn't know it was bad information. I have no such sympathy for Labour because they weren't inside that wall for the last 14 years. They only went inside it now. And we see Ed Miliband refusing to engage with people. Like Jim Ratcliffe's been pretty vocal about this, that Miliband will not allow him to discuss the North Sea. That as soon as he tries to bring it up, it gets shut down. And so that is not, that's willful. That is a refusal to hear anything that might challenge your view. And that is not, as I said before, it should not be the way that public policy is determined. So I can't answer why Miliband refuses. It must just come down to his personal ideology and he doesn't want anything to challenge it. But really, we're then in the territory of religion and not science.
I mean, is it that clear cut? Because I think most environmental activists who care about climate change would argue that this is a moral crusade, that is the ideological part. They think they are doing things that are going to solve this problem long term.
But I'm sorry, but this doesn't explain why you would prefer to import oil and gas when you know it has a higher environmental footprint than to produce it yourself.
Well, again, they would argue that to set an example to the rest of the world, it starts at home. So the leave it in the ground movement is what preceded this current wave.
But our consumption isn't falling. The only thing that's driving a reduction in consumption is deindustrialization. But that promotes a higher increase in global emissions because we're simply offshoring our production to places with dirtier energy. So none of this, or so first of all, the lead the world by example is bizarrely neo-colonial and hubristic because nobody's following us. And the idea that we should dictate to other countries how they should do things is just weird. And secondly, it is not contributing to a reduction in emissions. It's counterproductive. And so once you understand that your strategy is doing the opposite to what you say is necessary, then you should change your strategy. You don't double down.
Right, David, you have some experience of other countries that want to dictate to us what we should do.
I mean, I'm certainly not a believer in the, let's set an example and everybody will follow. We've been setting an example for a very long time in this country, actually, on this, and our emissions have fallen by quite a lot, our territorial emissions. And the problem is that nobody's really following us, that the example that we're setting is making no difference. And, it just seems that the debate within Western countries, most Western countries over the last 20 years, has had a kind of hysterical quality to it, in which you simply could not express dissenting opinions, that it has been more like a kind of religious ideology in some form that you're just not allowed to dissent from. And I guess, I wonder whether some of this hysteria is now disappearing, that fundamentally people are kind of stopping believing that there is an existential threat to the planet in the way that people were quite happy to say 5 years ago. Michael Gove with Greta Thunberg and all this. It all looks a bit kind of comic and hysterical and a bit sort of odd in retrospect. And I feel like something is changing, not that people are necessarily stopping believing that carbon emissions are gradually increasing global temperatures, but that they're stopping believing that has sort of apocalyptic consequences and beginning to look at things differently.
Well, I think certainly the idea that it's causing near-term apocalyptic consequences is losing traction because 20 years ago, people were telling us that we would be having to hold this event in scuba gear because London would be underwater, along with, the Netherlands and so on. And clearly, I mean, it's not just that London isn't underwater, it's not even close to being underwater. I mean, the idea that London is in any sort of imminent risk of permanent submersion is just fanciful. But if you go back, you will find Guardian articles from 2000 and that sort of era confidently saying that, London would be underwater, that the Arctic would be ice-free in the summer, and all of these things. It just haven't come about. So at some point, that those narratives and that hysteria does start to lose power.
So we're very much in the territory there of the Bjorn Lundberg criticism of climate catastrophism and the evidence that the number of people who are harmed by climatic events has been falling massively over the last 100 years as a result of economic progress. Obviously, the root of economic progress is growth, and at the root of religion is sacrifice. And where it comes to Aberdeen, it does seem from the work that you've done, I think the key statistic was 1,000 jobs a month, that workers in a former industrial area are being sacrificed on the altar of this new religion. And it's still not penetrating with the supposed party of Labour.
I'm not sure that I would put it quite so strongly because I think that it's not penetrating with Ed Miliband and his inner circle. But, we're seeing traditional strong Labour supporters in the unions being increasingly vocal about the harm that's happening in Aberdeen and in the North Sea, and in the supply chains as well that support those industries. And, you are hearing dissatisfaction in the Labour backbenches around this. When Labour starts to lose its core supporters on topics, this is not something that can be dismissed easily. And so I think we are going to see some sort of a change, but this really starts coming down to sort of commentary around what you actually think the internal power dynamics within the Labour Party are, which I think are pretty difficult to call at the moment. But I do think there are cracks there, because it's not a universally held position within Labour and within the wider Labour movement that what's happening is good.
I mean, Dave, you have contact, particularly in the Lords, with people in the Labour movement who take a more nuanced position on this issue.
Yeah, my impression is there are not many. There are certainly very few who are willing to say it publicly. There may be more who are kind of at the back of their minds, they're beginning to kind of wonder about this, but it's something less than a movement, I would say, within the Labour Party. That's my impression anyway. And I do think, the narrative control is still extremely strong. It is now possible to dissent from it without disaster for individuals and to express contrary views. But the kind of establishment view, the received wisdom is still very strong. And one of the kind of complaints, grumbles I've always had with the anti-net zero movement is the difficulty we seem to have in expressing the counter case sort of simply and persuasively. Why are renewables so expensive? For example, say one example, we often kind of go off into a sort of analysis of AR6 and AR7 and so on and so on, and you've just kind of lost people. And I think we need to be much more kind of populist about some of the key things that we are trying to put out, so that people can grasp it intuitively and quickly. And I think that's the sort of thing that might start to kind of begin to be harder to deal with for that group of people in Labour and elsewhere who think, I'm not entirely sure about this, but I haven't really heard a compelling counter case yet. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to make it understandable. And I don't know, Kathryn, you've written lots on this and are much better at making it clear than most in my experience.
So I think one thing that's interesting now is that we're seeing a shift in the finger-pointing narratives coming from the establishment. So until recently, it was all gas being demonized. So prior to late 2021, nobody talked about gas prices. We'd had 25 plus years of very low, stable gas prices. And so it just wasn't part of the discussion. It was not part of the net zero discussion in terms of cost. Then, of course, we had the asymmetric demand and supply recoveries at the end of COVID, and that started to boost gas prices. And that would have been a short-term effect were it not for the Russian invasion of Ukraine the following February, and then the need to replace Russian gas out of the European energy mix. But that's been done now. By the end of last year, enough new LNG had come into the market to do that. And this year, the global gas market is expected to go into length. And if you look at the forward curve, you see it's very strongly downward sloping. Global is TTF, NBP, JKM, all very much downward sloping. So we are now entering a new phase of global gas prices. And so, of course, it's no longer viable to say gas prices are the driving factor behind bills, because I think most people now realise that's just not the case. And so we saw the energy companies before the Select Committee in October pretty clearly articulating that policy costs were now the key driver of bills. And so what do we see now? We see now people are saying, oh, yes, underinvestment in the electricity grid is now it has to be in a catch-up phase. And so now this is what's driving high energy prices. But of course, that's also rubbish, because if you read the detail of the price control, and most of the money is being allocated to connections, not to non-load capex. But it's more smoke and mirrors. And I think we're going to see more of that, more people coming out and blaming catch-up investments. Now, I actually think that we are going to see a lot more money being spent on legacy infrastructure in this price control through reopeners, because there's not enough been allocated up front. But based on the current allocation in RIIO-3, a lot more money is going into connecting renewables than it is going to upgrade existing infrastructure. So we're seeing these dishonest narratives evolve in response to the changing realities of gas prices, but still trying in some way to pin the blame on conventional energy. But I actually think that the more they try and do this and try and shift the "oh yes, but," people are just increasingly seeing through it.
So I think they're beginning to, but I wonder whether we are sort of kidding ourselves a bit. I haven't seen any polling evidence on this, so I don't know. But I bet if you walk out into the streets and say, why are energy prices so high, many people still say it's Vladimir Putin and Ukraine that's the cause of this, because that's still what people hear, and the counter arguments are a bit complicated. And if they'd heard you, Kathryn, they might say, well, yeah, but suppose he invades somewhere else and gas prices go up again. Don't we need security for our own windmills?
Well, okay, so this is quite interesting, because I was at a focus group with Martin Copeland, who's also here, and this focus group, I don't know other people, I wasn't just us, but we were observing a focus group where a group of ordinary people were being asked about energy, and not one of them picked up on gas being to blame for bills being high. We couldn't believe it. We were absolutely staggered that that message hadn't got through.
Interesting. So what was their
They didn't really know. One person was like, "Oh, maybe I need to look at something other than TikTok to get my, information about what's going on in the world," which I thought was actually quite self-aware, actually. But and then interestingly, one of the group who worked in finance pointed out that everybody has a direct financial interest in oil and gas and energy more broadly because of our pensions. And so we were like, "Wow, that also we didn't expect." And we were like high-fiving in the back, because it's like, obviously great to hear that coming out. But it was very interesting that the gas being responsible narrative, in that group at least, hadn't cut through at all.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah.
Where it has cut through is the consensus in Parliament is now broken on net zero. And the Conservatives are not known for taking big risks with public opinion, so they're clearly seeing something in the underlying polling data that has persuaded them to shift.
Okay, so I don't think that it's the polling data that's motivating this. So and this is just my impression, but my impression is that I think they understood in 2023 that something wasn't right, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. And so they started thinking about why something isn't adding up, but we don't quite know what it is. And Claire wanted the department to come up with the full system cost of each generating technology to help build that understanding, something that Ed Miliband then cancelled when he came into office. Then obviously they lost the election pretty disastrously, and understood, I think, that there'd been a massive loss of trust and confidence in the Conservatives more broadly. I think this prompted them to go back to first principles, not just in energy, but across the board. And I think that's really why we didn't see very much by way of policy announcements from the Conservatives for the first year of this Parliament. From my discussions with them around energy, it was very much going back to a blank piece of paper and saying, we've just got this completely wrong. We don't know why, but we've just gone off track in some way. And so we need to now do the work to find out what on track looks like. And the conversations have been very much around, okay, we need to know what reality is in energy, but I suspect in other areas as well. And then we need to think, well, what policies do we have to formulate in order to deliver good in this reality? And then we have to start selling those policies to the public. And so they're just exiting phase one and starting with phase two, which is why we're now starting to see policy announcements coming through. So I don't think this was motivated by polling around what people think now. I think it was motivated by a sense they'd got it wrong and a huge defeat at the ballot box, which confirmed the idea that they'd got it wrong, at least in the minds of voters. I mean, you don't need more polling than that, really. And then trying to do the work in a very sort of rigorous way from first principles. And I think, Kemi with her engineering background, I think that's kind of what's originating that. If I were designing policy, that's how I'd do it. I'd start off with understanding the world and then trying to work out what you need to do to make it better.
So on the other side of the fence of the centre-right, reform have clearly been strong in this area for a very long time. And Robert Jenrick came out today and said again that he's going to do something about the North Sea, although not specifically what. I mean, do you think reform, if they do manage to form an administration, either alone or with the Conservatives, are going to turn this around? Can they actually save the North Sea from the current policies?
I mean, I have no particular insights, obviously, into reform policymaking in this area, but I must say, I think I'm slightly unconvinced that the Conservatives would have moved quite as fast as they have, Kathryn, if reform weren't already out there sort of denouncing net zero. I think that's made it impossible for them to avoid the question and has maybe accelerated Claire's kind of rethinking of the whole thing. I mean, I don't perceive there being much difference now between Reform and the Conservatives on this question, maybe questions of detail. Both are, I think, committed to repealing the fundamentals of the system now. Whether they really understand yet all the consequentials of that, we'll have to see. But there is now a clear sort of left-right divide on this question, which I suppose is the other reason why it's kind of broken out into popular discussion. Even the BBC can't entirely avoid it, but there's mainstream political disagreement on the subject.
But I think, so in terms of how you can fix it, nobody really can fix it, because the governance frameworks don't allow it. So yes, of course, the government can change the tax regime and lift the ban on drilling, and that would definitely be helpful. But more broadly, to fix the things that need to be fixed in order to get cheap energy and to restart economic growth, you need much wider changes of governance. And actually, for sort of think tank people in the room, if you really, really want to contribute to that, what you need to be doing is funding the drafting of legislation to do things like repeal the Constitutional Governance and Reform Act, repeal the Climate Change Act, amend all of the environmental and planning regulations that are making it impossible to get stuff done, so that an incoming government in 2029 can get that started straight away and doesn't have to then waste time drafting, because we can all spend as much time as we like designing policy ideas for energy, but right now this is just I think marginal in terms of the effort that's required to really secure change.
I do want to push on this point though. If an incoming government decided to cut the 78% tax rate on the North Sea down to the same level as normal corporation tax, if they changed the investment incentives, if they made it very clear that they were going to start fracking, do you think it's too late? Do you think investors would come back, or would they just not trust it would stick around?
I don't think it's too late. I think investors would actually buy it, because if you look at the fiscal position around net decommissioning, that's a pretty compelling thing to want to avoid. The idea that in the early 2030s, the Treasury will be paying billions of pounds a year out of the door to support North Sea decommissioning. And that's not a subsidy. I know people will probably start presenting it as a subsidy, but it's a rebate. And if it doesn't get paid, then there's a very good chance that those companies will walk away from their decommissioning obligations because the government will have broken the contract. So not having to pay out billions of net payments and saying that you're going to change your policies to avoid that, I think people will buy it because it's totally rational.
Okay, so that was almost optimism that it could be turned around.
Well, I do have some sense of optimism in the sense that I don't believe Labour will win the next election. I think there's a reasonable chance that the next election would happen before 2029, because I do see reasons that Labour would fail to pass budgets in the coming years. I still think it's more likely to be 2029 than not, I would say, but despite having a massive majority, I do see pathways to earlier elections, and I think people should be ready for that. But I think that there's a scope for opportunism here if people are willing to deploy capital in an opportunistic way, and I think there are companies looking at it in that way. So that provides a scope for optimism. But I think if we leave it too much longer, and if for some disastrous reason we saw some sort of Green Labour coalition at the next election, then I think that would tip it over the edge.
Fantastic.
It definitely would be fantastic.
Before we move to questions, I just have a couple of other quick points to raise. Maybe the first is, why don't disasters change public opinion? Why did the Sri Lanka thing not make people think again? Why did the blackout in Spain just and there's nothing to see here, Leslie Nielsen in front of the fireworks? It's just like nothing to worry about. It's all fine. Don't look too closely. That's the kind of message. Why? And of course, our near blackouts this time last year. Why doesn't this make people think again? Are we making enough of, I suppose, the near disasters that happened?
Well, okay, I think it's an unfortunate truth that disasters and political unrest in the developing world doesn't land in the same way that it does in the developed world. So people will see food riots in Sri Lanka and not really associate that with something that could happen here, and then discount it accordingly. And only 11 people died in Spain. Now, although subsequent research has suggested 165 excess deaths, primarily women over 80 in Spain, not Portugal, interestingly, are associated with the blackout, that doesn't grab attention. But in the same way, up until about 2022, 2023, the ONS was publishing data on excess mortality in the UK linked with fuel poverty. And they were saying that between 6,000 and 8,000 people a year were dying prematurely as a result of fuel poverty. Nobody ever talked about that. I mean, how is that not a scandal? 8,000 people a year dying because they can't heat their homes properly. And I asked ONS why they'd stop publishing this, and they said it was under review and they couldn't say when that review would end. But we have selective blindness about these things. It was, I think, insufficiently dramatic.
Yes, maybe that is the explanation. I have one last question myself, or comment, which is to ask what you think of the thesis which I guess Ambrose Evans Pritchard has been advocating for the last couple of years, that we've all just got this wrong on the free market right, and we're on the verge of a breakthrough that's going to give us abundant free electricity from all these new sources, and we're just misreading the situation by fussing about oil and gas. And I mean, I obviously I find this kind of intuitively implausible, though you can't say it could never happen one day. But I was interested in what you thought of the thesis. Is it just crazy at this point?
Well, I mean, the whole technology will get us out of trouble. The get out of jail free card. It gets used all the time in all sorts of different contexts, but we see time and again it doesn't happen. So my first job in banking was started in the late 90s, and I was doing IPOs for technology companies. And at the time, everybody was talking, it was the dot-com years, and mobile pay. Everybody was talking about mobile pay. You're going to use your mobile phone to pay for stuff. But it took 25 years and it's still not mainstream. More people do not buy things with their mobile phones than do. And so even if you have got a good narrative that a technology is on the verge of commercialization, which mobile pay was in 2000, it can still take a very long time, far, far longer than you would expect, for that to actually become commercialized and then to actually become mainstream. And so I don't think you can ever, and I actually think it's quite irresponsible to say, oh, well, we can be complacent, we can just sit back and do nothing because technology is on the verge of solving this. In the meantime, 6,000 to 8,000 people are dying a year from fuel poverty. We're seeing a massive, massive reduction in industrial activity, in jobs. The harms that we're identifying and the risk of people dying in blackouts is going up, year on year. So are you really going to take that gamble? I mean, that just seems kind of immoral to me.
I mean, it just seems to me that, his thesis, or theses like these anyway, depend on the belief that there is going to be some massive breakthrough in storage or battery technology soon, that must be part of the solution. I just don't see any evidence for that at all, really.
Well, I don't see evidence of it, but even if I did, I don't think you can be complacent about it. I think you always have to deal with the reality the way it is now. Now, you might have hope about how that reality will evolve, but you can't assume. And I think that, why do we buy insurance? We buy insurance because we want to protect ourselves against downsides. Your house burning down might be unlikely, but if it does happen, it's extraordinarily damaging. And so to sit around and say, oh, we'll just hope for the best, I just don't think that's very responsible.
On that cheerful note, I, of course, am holding out for Swansea Tidal Bay to come back. And I think the solution to make it affordable clearly is to add a fish disco to the inlet bites. If anybody has some better ideas than that, I'd love to hear from you.
I'm really interested to know from the panel. So sorry, Alex from the World Power Club podcast and chair of the Spectator Energy site. I'm really interested in this. Labour backs high carbon, high employing solutions like Heathrow and the steelworks. Is it simply because the North Shelf is the furthest point away from Westminster, or is it something more complicated than?
Well, that's a very political question. So I don't know, maybe David's in a better place to answer that.
I'm not a politician. I think it is a general feature of UK politics that, whichever party, unfortunately, people pay greater attention to what's going on in southeast England than elsewhere. As the scale of change that's happening in Aberdeen, for example. There's a good Spiked film about this at the moment, if people haven't seen it, and that scale of change, I think, would attract much, much more comment if it was happening in Reading, say, or wherever. It just was. So I think that is part of the problem. And of course, Labour have, got an uncertain grip on their old heartland in Scotland now. And I think that is part of it. I think one just has to be realistic about these things.
When it affects the price of avocados, they're going to notice. Next question. Yes, the gentleman here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm also called Alex, and I work in risk and sustainability. What's going wrong with the education sector? Because the decision makers in about 10 years' time should be learning about this stuff in a balanced way at school. I mean, my kids come back and they're talking about climate change, and it's nothing like the reality that we've understood. Have you got a comment on that, the education sector?
Well, I respond for the IEA because next week I'll be in Portsmouth speaking to school children about free market environmentalism and some of these issues. And you generally get a very good response from the kids. They don't come across as little Greta Thunbergs in the main. They do come across as people who are keen to learn and keen to challenge. And the climate position is the position of their parents. The millennial generation are now all having their kids and they're all growing up and they're starting to disagree. So I think you've got grounds for optimism there. And also any good teacher is going to welcome debate. And they do exist.
But unfortunately, education has been shown. There was a study recently that said it probably had the highest level of left-wing capture of any part of the establishment. And coupled with that, there's just not enough scientists. And that's true in Westminster and Whitehall as well. But it's also particularly true in schools. And it's why Labour's insistence that teachers have a teaching qualification is so damaging, actually, because there's an awful lot of qualified physicists, for example, qualified people with physics degrees who are interested potentially in teaching, who just don't want to go and spend, 2 years getting a PGCE. And they're being employed in the private sector to great effect. But you're not seeing that in the state sector. How many people actually have a physics graduate teaching them physics?
Yeah, not for much longer either. Once the new schools bill is in, that's going to require everyone to have a PGCE, whichever kind of school they're in. So that's going to squeeze people out. I do think there's a bigger thing behind it, and Christian Nemes touches on it actually in his interesting introduction to your pamphlet, which is that, and it's not really a new observation, but I think it's relevant to schools, that the sort of intellectuals and people who deal with words and ideas are very removed from the realities of actually doing and building things. And I include myself in that. And I think that's why some of the things that seem like obvious about the energy sectors, people who are involved in it, just do not seem obvious at all to people whose job is to kind of be the second-hand merchants in ideas, as Hayek put in. I think that's probably particularly true in schools and the education system. People are retailing others' ideas to people who don't always have the ability to challenge it. And they, how you build a nuclear power station is just, it's another world.
And I think there's an extent to which that's infected with privilege as well, because you see so much privilege in the way that energy policy is formulated. If you look at the way people talk about flexibility in the electricity market and this assumption that it's all marvelous because people can charge their electric cars at night. And of course, how many people in real life have an electric car with off-street parking that they can charge at night? Oh, you can do your laundry at night. Well, no, you can't. Not if you live in a multi-occupancy building where your rental agreement or your lease almost certainly prohibits it. And every fire brigade in the country says, don't leave your white goods, with electric motors in, there, washing machines and dryers and dishwashers running unattended because of the fire risk. So you effectively push people on low incomes into a nocturnal lifestyle so they could stay up and watch their washing machine if they don't live in a building of multi-occupancy. So you see what I mean? The people who live in nice detached houses with Mueller washing machines can, program it and happily go to bed. But somebody on a low income living in a block of flats with, a hot point from the 1980s, maybe not so much.
Although even there are grounds for optimism. I mean, the reason some planning regulations are changing is because some of these people living in nice houses have noticed that all of their treasured projects with solar panels and heat pumps and everything else can't happen because of the very rules that they've been supporting. Next question. Lady in that row there.
Hi, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the amount of energy that data centers use. I'm not an expert, but I've read that it's an awful lot. And why doesn't it attract the same amount of criticism from kind of the green lobby that other forms of energy like fossil fuels do?
Well, that's a great question. And you could also extend it to say, why do they not see the correlation also with their use of social media, for example? Younger people tend to believe that they have a lower energy footprint than older people. But actually, if you look at their use of digital media, that's not really the case. When I was growing up, many years ago, if you wanted to take a photograph, you had a camera that had a film in it that had 24 or 36 exposures. You would take one picture of the subject. And then once you'd taken your 24 or 36 pictures, you'd go to the chemist or wherever and they would develop it for you. And you'd look at the pictures and you'd be like, oh gosh, these are all terrible. But occasionally you'd see one that was actually quite good. Then this picture would be so precious, you would actually spend some money to get a few copies of it made. Now, if you think about what happens with pictures, you take 7 or 8 in one go, and then you choose the ones you like the best and you start messing around and put some filters on it. And your phone backs up to the cloud, and then you'll put it on your socials, and that gets backed up to the cloud, and you'll send it to all the people in your WhatsApp, and you'll put it on Snapchat or whatever, Insta, all the rest of it. You might put it on like 4 or 5 different platforms. They're all getting backed up. So now instead of your one photograph, or your maybe half a dozen that you pay extra for because it's so amazing, every picture you take, there's like 20, 30, 50 copies of it, how often do you ever go back and delete them? How many times do you actually go back and delete old pictures? Or you say, oh, I just took these 6 pictures of, whatever it was, my dinner. And because now we say pictures, all sorts of random stuff we never used to think was worth taking photos of. But all of that uses energy, right? All of that, just storing it, there's a cost to that, which people, so why do we not talk about that? I think with AI, the cost of compute as well as the cost of energy is going to drive some change. So amusing as it might be, horrifically, to make bikini pictures of Keir Starmer, it's actually a waste of both energy and compute. And so we go, well, in fact, we already are starting to see performance throttling for the free versions of LLMs. So people pay for their AIs in a professional context. I pay a high subscription for ChatGPT and all the rest of it. But I don't use it for making bikini pictures of anyone. But I think we'll start to see price differentiation and performance differentiation at the lower end to try and limit the waste associated with that.
Do you think AI, the supposed need for vast quantities of new power generation to fund computer power for AI, do you think that's part of the shift in elite opinion that is happening? You think in the US particularly, people are thinking, well, if it comes to windmills or not having AI and data centers, we're going to go for the latter.
Oh, we are definitely seeing that, which is why we've seen people like Bill Gates, I think, shifting their position so dramatically. It was easy to say we need lots of renewables when it had no cost to them particularly, but now that it has a significant cost, and we are going to see huge competition for copper as well. In fact, I can't remember where I read it, but in the last couple of days, I read another thing about copper being a huge constraint. It inevitably is. You need a huge amount of copper to build offshore wind. You need loads of copper to upgrade the grid, and you need copper for AI, although they're trying to engineer that out. But yes, I think resource competition is going to be quite a significant driver there. And we're going to see it here, right? So first of all, we're not seeing anybody really realistically wanting to put data centers on the grid. And increasingly, that's not just here, that's across the developed world. There just isn't the capacity, but also technology companies are a little bit worried about reputational exposure here, that if they connect to the power grid with a large new source of demand, and then at some point in the future something goes wrong on that power grid, even if it has nothing to do with them, they're worried that they will get political fallout and reputational harm. So they want to go off the grid. But there are huge supply chain constraints around equipment. So I've just come back from a trip to the US and Canada, and people are talking about and actually doing. They're putting a gigawatt's worth of power for data centers with a football field full of 3 megawatt research. This is an insane way. I mean, it gives you a huge amount of response flexibility, but it's not the best way to do your whole load requirements. But the point is, the emissions rules on that in Europe are very unhelpful. I mean, you'd be very hard pushed to put together a project like that in Europe. So I think what we'll see is technology companies coming to European governments and saying, the only way we can power this data center is using small reciprocating engines and maybe some open cycle gas turbines. But there's no way it's economic based on current emissions rules. So you can choose. You can keep your emissions rules and we'll go somewhere else. And there's massive expansion of power capacity in the Middle East that is just looking for this data center consumption to come to them, or you've got to compromise on your emissions rules.
Yeah, data center drones and robots. I don't know if people have seen the Chinese robots dancing video that came out in the last 48 hours, but it's not worrying you about our technological gap. It should do. Right. I'm going to go here first, then here. The gentleman behind you. Sorry.
Thank you. Ian Taylor, I'd just like to make a couple of comments regarding the idea of breakthroughs, because we constantly get told about possible breakthroughs that people think are going to happen, and then they don't. It strikes me the whole thing about a breakthrough is it is to some extent unexpected. For that reason, I like to never say never. However, a precautionary note, I do remember when the first atomic power stations opened, we were promised it would make electricity so cheap it couldn't be metered. Well, I mean, that's a very bad joke now, to put it mildly.
What's the question, please, sir?
So, I'd just like your thoughts on that generally. The other thing, of course, being nuclear fusion. Now, once again, never say never, but for most of my life, we've been told it's about 20 or 30 years in the future, and the years go by, and we don't seem to get much nearer. Might it happen?
Okay, so fusion and breakthroughs, and gentlemen just here in the front, we'll take 2 questions at a time.
My name is Morten Frisch. I live in the United Kingdom, but I'm originally Norwegian, but I lived there for 50 years. And I'm an energy strategist, a petroleum engineer, and also an energy economist. And I've actually helped Kathryn with connections and data about oil and gas and electricity from at home in Norway. Regarding how to present this to the public, with intermittent wind and solar power, because of the backup, you need 2 parallel systems for your supply. When you buy 2 systems for the same function, that costs a lot of money, and that's where now the high prices are coming home here, not just in the United Kingdom. Germany is an even better example of that, where they probably have to spend something like €1 trillion to solve that problem. And another, just a point, international point. The Chinese, a year ago, did a big study, determined that they really shouldn't take intermittent wind and solar power more than 20% of the energy mix. They now started introducing restrictions on this. Yet, they are subsidizing the production of solar panels, wind turbines, selling them internationally. Why? They are working to a 50-year. We are working with the Chinese. They're working with the 50-year time horizon. They want to weaken Western economies, and they do that with solar and wind power.
Okay, so more of a point than a question. But on the breakthrough first, and then potentially the dual system aspects.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree, never say never, but you can't take it for granted. So you have to, if it comes along, fantastic, exploit it. And certainly we should not stop funding innovation. So we should contribute modest amounts to innovation funding. But I think that's about as far as you can go with that sensibly. And I would agree that fusion is, 20 to 30 years away, always. If you look at where the technology is at the moment, you still need at least 1, if not 2 orders of magnitude more heat gains from the reaction to have anything close to being commercially viable. And plus you need to sustain the reactions for far longer than they're doing. So that they talk a good game. They talk a very good game in terms of the progress that they've made. But the way to go to have something commercially viable is very long. It's decades of work.
And just to react to the comments you made, sir, I think your first point really is one of the sort of frustrations I have when I go back to the point I made earlier about simple arguments, that it seems to me like one of the most powerful arguments as to why renewables are going to be more expensive is they require 2 systems, so that's always going to be more expensive. And you kind of almost don't need to know anything more than that to see that it's going to cost you more. Yet somehow this, a lot of intellectual and political energy goes into trying to obfuscate that simple fact. Similarly, the decision that you say the Chinese took not to have more than 20% renewables on the grid, very wise, but you still hear the argument here that all we need to do is accelerate renewables. We need to replace oil and gas more quickly with more renewables, or that we can somehow do both, and that this is going to be part of the solution rather than something makes the problems worse. And again, it's just a comment. We don't seem to be able to land sort of fairly basic points about the systems that would make our task a lot easier, I think.
Yes, gentleman, right at the back there, and then over here.
I had an international career in most aspects of the energy business. I think so far as the renewables investments are concerned, we need to be focusing on the absolutely humongous plans for the grid. It's hundreds of billions that we're talking about. Puts the cost of a few wind farms into triviality, frankly. I think that really is a very, very important thing. Second thing is that the second thing is that we are now at the foothills of curtailment. We've reached the point where the capacity of renewables is capable of just about supplying the lowest quantities of demand that we have. As we add capacity, you get a surplus. That surplus is uneconomic to store. It is going to grow enormously as capacity is added. It's a new feature of life, and it is going to make the system enormously more costly because it's waste.
I'm going to take those questions about the cost of the grid and curtailment, and there's a gentleman over here.
Thank you, Simon Morn. Kathryn, you say in the report there's a risk of basically loss of power, loss of heating as early as next winter, 26, 27. What happens in that situation? Do we fine the companies or sue them and they go out of business? Is that an excuse to nationalize them? Or do we just have a stiff upper lip like good Brits and go to Granny's funeral?
Well, it's not going to be caused by companies. So no, I mean, that would be extraordinarily unjust to start fining companies for blackouts because they didn't have energy to sell. Now, I don't think this begins next year. I think you're referring to the potential gas shortages on cold winter days. National Gas is warning that this might manifest as early as next winter. I don't think that's the case, that it will be next winter, because we're not seeing announcements of the pipeline closures that would precede that. But definitely before the 2030s, which I think is essentially NESO's view, it will start around 2030. I think the answer's in between. And so what happens? There just is not enough gas on the British grid to meet demand. Well, who's responsible for that? The answer is nobody. Under our laws, nobody has responsibility for security of supply. Suppliers definitely don't. Suppliers are like retail banks. They handle people's money and they do some accounting. That's it. So you can't you can always find them, but it just wouldn't be fair. Then you look at, the generators. Well, all they do is they buy gas in the market and they generate electricity with it, or they, utilize whatever wind and solar is around to generate electricity. You don't fine a wind farm when it's not windy. They just don't earn an income. So those gas generators, if they sold forward, then they'll lose money because they won't be able to deliver on those contracts. But you can't bind them because they're not doing anything, right? They haven't caused the shortage. Would you fine the gas companies? Well, again, they can only buy the gas that's available. Or use the gas so if the gas can't arrive in the UK because there aren't enough pipelines, well, that's not the fault of the gas companies. If the LNG capacity is full, if the terminals are being used at full capacity, then who are you going to fine, and for what reason? So no, and I also do think we have to get away from this sort of revenge fantasies that we have around utilities. It's we see it a lot in the water sector. I don't think that trying to, tar and feather or whatever is actually all that helpful. We do need to have people responsible for security of supply, but that needs to be determined at the policy level, and at the moment it isn't. And sorry, on grid, I agree with you. Yeah, we're going to see massive investments in grid because we're building so much low energy density generation. It requires orders of magnitude more resources to connect. And, curtailment is just, it's a scandal that people are not talking enough about.
While we're on the security of supply question, what do you think about the policy that's emerged over the last 4 or 5 years to put a lot of reliance on electricity interconnectors to various parts of continental Europe? It seems like not the best idea we've ever had.
Well, there's a couple of interesting things here. I mean, one is that in 2021 Ofgem wrote a report where they said once you become a net exporter, which is what they anticipate we will be, then interconnectors then represent a disbenefit to consumers. And then they used that as a basis for declining all but one of the Window 3 projects in the cap and floor. And I put this to a senior person in Ofgem because they were saying, oh, we can't, this new thing about energy nationalism is not good. We can't have people being so selfish about their resources. And I went, you wrote a report in 2021 that said there'd be a consumer disbenefit from interconnectors, and then you declined all these new interconnectors. So are you not doing the exact thing that you think other people shouldn't do? And they went, oh yeah, I guess we are. We are seeing an increase in energy nationalism. We're seeing a very strong political pushback in Norway around interconnectors. They had parliamentary elections back in September, and this was an issue in the election. If we went outside on the street here and stopped a person and said, what do you think about electricity interconnection? They would say, leave me alone, you weirdo. I'm going to call the police. If you went to Oslo and asked the same question, they would give you a detailed opinion about it. So yes, Norway does not like, and there's parts of Norwegian Parliament want to cancel the interconnector deals with Britain and Germany. I think they probably won't, but there is a pressure. France, they don't dislike interconnection, but they're building on a very aging nuclear fleet. And the French regulator has said that, we've seen twice in the past 6 or 7 years, large parts of the fleet having to be taken out of service for systemic reasons. Most recently, the stress corrosion issue, which is an age-related defect affecting 2 classes of French reactors. The regulator has said we should expect similar things to happen in the future as that fleet ages. And why are France and Norway important is because they're the only ones who don't have essentially the same energy mix and policy that we do. Everyone else that we're connected with is following a wind-led energy policy and actually has very similar weather to us. So when it's not windy here, it's often not windy in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Germany, and in Denmark in particular. Denmark's a basket case. So you then expose yourself to massive risk because even if these countries wanted to export to you, they can't because they're all so short. So everyone's just trying to buy their electricity from Norway and France, and Norway doesn't want to, and France might not be able to. So no, I think it's a really risky.
Yeah. Just on this point, I don't find energy nationalism at all surprising, I must admit, and I might have once, but my own opinions on this been shaped really by having been in government during the vaccine and so-called wars in 2020 and 2021, when, people, each European government, I think reasonably enough, put its own population first, regardless of what their commitments were to sell to others, regardless of the EU internal market commitments, they put their own population first. And I think when you're in a crisis, that will always happen. And you shouldn't have a system, an energy system that relies on people not doing that.
But also, it's fully consistent with international trade rules that you are absolutely entitled to restrict exports if you're suffering from a domestic shortage.
So we are at time. So are there any concluding remarks?
No.
Read the book. I'm maybe just to return to where we started this. I'm encouraged that we've got the glimmers of light, maybe even more than glimmers actually on this now, that the super tanker is beginning to turn around. You can make the counter case. People are listening to the arguments. And I think we published here at the IEA a paper on the Renewables AR7 costs 2 or 3 weeks ago. Got a huge interest in the media, much more than I thought actually, and I think people are beginning to listen and think and fingers crossed, we're going to see this changing, if not tomorrow, but soon.
Thank you very much. Could I see some appreciation for our speakers? Thank you.